Thanks a lot for having me here. And today I will be talking about a missionary movement, the Tablighi Jamaat, which depends how much you actually know about these types of movements and how much you are familiar with this type of mobilization. So it could be a lot of things that are difficult to understand for some, and for others it could be something that you already know and you're still waiting for further details. Let me try to contextualize the movement. The interesting part about it is that it's a modern missionary movement, perhaps one of the very few, if not the only one, with such an extensive influence across the world and across Muslim communities. That is in a sense unusual because the task of missionary activity, what's called dawah, is a task which is to be observed by every Muslim, but there are very few organized formats that in themselves focus on this particular task only. And the interesting part about this particular activity of this particular movement is that it started from a region, South Asia namely, which by some is considered to be the margins of the Muslim world. That is, to some extent, far away from the Arabic-speaking centers of Mecca and Medina, where some of Muslims from the region around Mecca and Medina occasionally even look down at Muslims from South Asia, whether they are really or real Muslims or not. And yet, the movement in this name managed what I sometimes call to cross the ethnic divide and become a normative global player, because their branches in several countries have members exclusively from the local population. That is the case in countries like France or Morocco or Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia, or Kyrgyzstan, for instance, whereas in others they are strongly relying on the Muslims or migrants or descendants of migrants from the larger, older South Asian diaspora. I come for my research from the discipline of political science, and my inquiries and my perspectives are not specifically limited to Islamic studies only, but my interest in the subject relates to the ways how this particular format, how this particular movement engages in what people call world making. That is how this particular movement manages to establish a global system and floor, place, space of operation with respective practices that has its own meaning, and that to some extent symbolizes globalization from the South, which is particularly important in times when a lot of people argue that globalization is actually limited as the origin to the West, and some even say to the banking sector, to the financial sector, where there is no space and time anymore involved for those operations. But as social scientists, as political scientists, even as people following cultural studies, we argue that this is a very shortcut notion of globalization, and there are many formats of global connectivity, global activity, which are going beyond the economy and which also are going even in terms of their origin and centers beyond the global north. And to understand what would it mean, I mean, what is the essence of world making in a sense? I mean, world making, to put it very simple and in a very short way, would mean that we are talking about interventions on a global scale where particular actors and particular institutions give a certain meaning to this intervention. So it's a certain interpretation, a certain kind of engagement that has a particular perspective and that involves a particular meaning. I will cut a bit short the many details of the perhaps too detailed presentation, but I just wanted to also highlight the fact that Muslim groups and Muslim networks are increasingly involved in such networking and in global connectivity, and that they actually are having different trajectories for this involvement. And within this larger framework, South Asia is not always on the screen of people who study Islam or who study Muslims and their activities. And that's actually quite strange. Although it is supposed to be existing on the nominational or denominational margins, symbolical margins of the Muslim world, yet 80% of all Muslims live in Asia. And only in South Asia we have 3 times 200 million Muslims in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh each, which is like 600 million Muslims, and that's more than twice the number of Arabic speakers. And in the sense, the Muslims from South Asia have also a particular advantage if we are talking about global interventions. That is, there's also what I would call a secular trajectory of their outreach, which is partly connected with the British colonial connections, when there existed a British Empire which prided itself in the fact that the sun was never setting down on it, that is, it was surrounding the world, a globalization in a much earlier stage than what we are talking today about. And at the same time, we also had Muslim trading castes even before the British arrived from Gujarat that were expanding to East and South Africa or to Southeast Asia. And we have lately a stage where these people as migrants have also expanded to the US, Canada and Australia. So this globalization created an enormous expanse. And on the other hand, this globalization had not only a secular trajectory but also a religious, a doctrinal trajectory where Sufi orders and their networks, and several of them are actually rooted in South Asia, had been spreading around the world. And you may know or not that India for 600 plus years was ruled by a Muslim dynasty, the Mughals, which were only overturned by the arrival of the British. South Asian groups had an enormous revival in the 19th century with the arrival of the British, and they, in a way, were some sort of replacement for nationalism, and many different sectarian orientations came into being that were spreading around the world, where I cannot even go into the details of everyone. I will just be in a minute briefly talking about that orientation which gave rise to the Tablighi Jamaat, that is the Deobandi network. So India, in a sense, was home to some of the earliest external branches of those Abrahamic religions, of every single one, of the Jews, of the Christians, and also of Islam, and for a very simple reason, because it's not very far from the Gulf to India. So you can go there easily and establish your own community, which people did right after the emergence of this particular faith. So therefore we have very old mosques in India from the 8th century, as we just saw. We have this expansive Muslim culture of the Mughal dynasty, where you see the paintings. And it is very interesting that we have all these doctrines which are negotiating amongst themselves a rather complicated ideological and practical struggle and battle. What is the right way to follow Islam and to practice it and to implement it yourself? Then we come to what we call the purists. The purists are a particular orientation that some relate back to the medieval times of Islam, but others in more practical and organizational terms relate back to the 19th century, when groups were coming up and were fighting for an Islam which was devoid of particular practices that had later entered into Muslim rituals. In particular, they were targeting Sufis and shrine worship, and one particular group, the Deobandis, is known for this reason that it established its religious center, seminary or madrasa in Deoband. This is the building, the historical building of that particular school, the Darul Uloom Deoband. And the founder of the Tablighi Jamaat, Muhammad Ilyas, was actually a Deobandi scholar and preacher. And this here is the rather modern building of the center of the Tablighi Jamaat in Nizamuddin, in a quarter of Delhi. And sorry, can I go back? No, it's not so easy. Yes, and there is the other center, the other name which I won't need to mention here is Rawalpindi. Rawalpindi is a small town next to the larger urban settlement center of Lahore in today's Pakistan, and it is the seat of the Pakistani center or markas of the Tablighis. This was the old Deoband school, and the Deoband's tradition, the Deoband school in itself, was already from the very beginning attracting also students actually from other countries. So here is the statistics where you can see at a certain point how many people from other countries had attended the seminary and the school. And here you could see a particular map where we see how the movement was spreading to other countries, other communities. And the reason why it was spreading was again very largely connected with the Tablighi Jamaat. The reason why it arose was that there was a trend of historical conversion of Muslims, of local Hindus to Muslims, or of local low-caste people to Muslims, that had been going on through the centuries. The reason being that how did it happen that Islam spread in South Asia? One aspect was military intervention in the northwest, and the other aspect was conversion. Why would people convert? There were basically two reasons. One was that the leader or the head of a local community, for cultural, political, religious, material gains or reasons, would change allegiance, and so would the community to follow him over which he was ruling. Or there was the other reason, where people who were having a disadvantage in social life, like the outcasts or the low-caste people, were looking for alternative ways to change, to transform their lives. And some or several communities, locally or across India, South Asia, would convert to Buddhism, others would convert to Christianity, and still others to Islam. And when the revival of religious movements in British colonial India happened, also as a reply or response to the rule by the West, to the rule by British colonialism, Hindus were trying also to mobilize, and they wanted to, what they thought, reconvert Muslims back to Hinduism. And in India, where so many different religions live so closely together, you also have a lot of aspects where people follow syncretic practices, which means Hindus visit Muslim shrines, Muslims visit Hindu shrines, and sometimes you cannot really fully draw a clear line between the different cultural traditions and practices that people follow. So some sort of Hindu nationalist impulses in the late 19th, early 20th century, which we are now seeing, so to say, at the government in India, in the shape of the BJP and Modi, were trying to find ways how to reconvert Muslims to Hinduism. This met with a response, and the response on behalf of Muslims was the Tablighi Jamaat, because a preacher, Muhammad Ilyas, he went to a particular tribal region not far from Delhi, Mewad, where the Hindu activists targeted a number of local Muslim communities with syncretic practices, trying to pull them back to Hinduism. So the Muslims went there thinking how to find ways to teach them in a very simple way how to practice Islam properly. How to do that. And Ilyas came up with this idea that those people who do not actually really have much knowledge about Islam, we take them and send them out as preachers. Because when you are forced to convince others, to preach others how to do it correctly, you also learn, and you will also change yourself. And in order to do that, he induced them to follow a very simple routine of 6 points of faith, which they would preach to people. So the main core activity of this group is forming preaching groups or jamaats, which move out and go around in a community, knock the doors, invite people to prayer, and invite them to again join their system. And this is a movement which does not have regular formalized membership, but it's a lay preaching movement. Although you have a particular share of activists who repeatedly take part, who become very intense followers. And how does this look? It looks something like this today. That a mass of people arrives at congregations, and there is a very expansive system of congregations that is mainly focused in South Asia, but also expands to all countries where branches of the Tablighi Jamaat exist. And they hold their meetings in vast areas, grounds, with open tents and with a formalized program of invitation and preaching. And this is also the interesting part from the perspective of a social scientist, a political scientist, as myself, because many of the members of the activists believe that this is just something where you go out on an emotional mobilization, because everybody should get up and do something. So in a way it's comparable to other ideological mobilization, secular mobilization, the green movement, the left movement, a lot of different movements operate in a similar way. Yet if we look closer, we will discover that there is a very clear and structured system of organization behind the movement, because otherwise you could not run a movement of several million. Today the estimates are that the movement has an impact or influence, and the estimates vary widely because it's not so easy to get to such numbers, between around the world somewhat 12 million or 80 million. Especially because of the fact that a lot of people just come and take part or then leave again. So what happens when they go out on Jamaat, as they call it, on this preaching group? Well, they arrive at the mosque usually at Deobandi 1, and that's in brackets also how the Deobandi mosques nowadays travel around the world, because where the Tablighi Jamaat established its branches and centers, in one way or the other, sooner or later, they also opened a Deobandi madrasa, at least in the place where their center is, where their markas is, from which they organize affairs in that particular country. So they're arriving there at the mosque, and then they're staying overnight on self-support. That's always very important for them to travel basically like young, small, like activists with their own mattress, with their own food, with their own support, and it should basically cost nothing, or they are expected to carry the expenses on themselves. Then after they arrive, they do a group session on education, on Talim, and here I have to mention the other famous personality in the founding and until today was Muhammad Zakaria, who was the nephew of the founder and who compiled a list of prophetic traditions, hadith, what's called the Fazail Amal, or virtue of good deeds, which has become, I'm not saying the Bible of the group, but the reference work to which everybody refers. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the system of these prophetic traditions. You perhaps know or not that the Muslims rely in terms of written sources both on the Quran and the prophetic traditions. And the prophetic traditions had been compiled by different people. That is what people were saying about what happened during the time of the Prophet and of his companions, the Sahaba. And those prophetic traditions are sometimes not clear which are authentic, which are not. So that's a struggle sometimes, a contestation, and that contestation is also partly affecting the Tablighi Jamaat, because this group, this book, the Fazail Amal, is also criticized for containing particular traditions which others, for instance, regard as non-authentic. Then there is a joint prayer, and then the people go out on the simple preaching walk, what they call Umumi Gasht, and this is also interesting. There's a very clear, almost bureaucratic vocabulary of the particular formats and particular practices that are being followed. And for instance, this one is the Umumi Gasht, the simple walk, and the Hususi Gasht, a special preaching walk for particular groups or professions of people. What is, for instance, for people who know the Tablighi Jamaat but not very closely, is often surprising that they also conduct particular tours for landholders, for professors, for artists, where they also accept to some extent the privileged position of those people and try to communicate in a way of which can reach them and by which they are accessible. So then after the walking tour, when they knock the doors, which people who are non-Muslims or people who are Muslims but not particularly observant can also find annoying, and there is quite some similarity with Jehovah's Witnesses and the way they're walking around, but which is always demonstrably peaceful, if only in the pushing away. After they come back from the walk, there will be another education session at the mosque, the talim session, and then what's very important always an inspirational talk, the bayan, where either the group leader and the annual congregations, which are already a very established tradition, a big leader, a prominent person will give the talk, and they have in their own vast system actually come up with celebrities. Some of the scholars are now celebrities that have and are enjoying a particular status. And this is how the ground looks. There is a map where they establish everything. Everything is designed. Every group from every village, community, etc. is assigned a particular place so that nothing goes wrong. And why? Because the congregation season, the ijtimas in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they attract each between 2 and 3 million people. And they pride themselves in being the largest congregation of Muslims after the Hajj in Mecca and Medina. Or this is, for instance, the layout plan for the Indian Ijtima. The philosophy of the movement are these 6 points on which they feel Islam rests. So this is opponents of the Tablighi Jamaat attack it sometimes as saying what you are representing is an Islam for simple minds, for uneducated people. Well, they have developed ways of turning those 6 points into educated discourses, into philosophical discourses where they emphasize one or the other aspect of it. Beside the traveling group, and that's some sort of innovation that came in the 50s or 60s, 70s, they also developed something called the mosque group or Masjid Var Jamaat. That is, a group residing at the mosque and having to do a certain amounts of duties, the 5 good deeds or 5 amal. So here you see how different organizational formats relate to different leadership formats and different meeting formats. You can already see the topic is quite elaborate. It will be too boring for you perhaps to now go into all the details of those particular practices. Here you can see a chart of the Tablighi Jamaat that during my research I was compiling to get a better idea of what's actually going on. When we talked about the demonstrative peacefulness, we are now realizing that it did not save them from internal conflict and even violence, because people who did not follow their activities are perhaps not aware that in June 2016, a brawl, a conflict broke out between two factions in the Nizamuddin Markaz, where the followers of one scholar were attacking the followers of another scholar. An unprecedented development. How did it happen? How did it come about? It happened because there was a conflict, or it was unclear who would be leading the system. And they have a system of a council, a shura, and then there is also the system of having an amir, or leader. And the question was that a global shura, or council, was formed in 92, 95 under the previous global amir, Imam al-Haq. And when he died and members died, two people were left, one Maulana Saad and one Maulana Zubair. They were leading it suddenly together, while before there was always a single amir. Now, after Zubair died, Maulana Saad was claiming to be the new amir. This led to a conflict that became violent. I could argue that this is also a product of the institutionalization and of the globalization, because what happens if you expand into the global universe, you have to create institutions and you have to create systems, and when you create them, you will undoubtedly face the question of ruling over them or controlling them, or keeping in line with them, and how to do that. So now there is this conflict where on one side Maulana Saad is scolded by the people who argue that there can only be a world council or alami shura for his egoism and for his claims to what they even say wrongful way of practicing Islam. And yes, indeed, he made such pronouncements where he said, whoever doesn't believe in my amirship can go to hell. But then the so-called peaceful and, well, almost democratic, almost basis democratic, grassroots democratic Shura Council was based and is based in Rawalpindi in Pakistan. How did the conflict develop? The conflict developed because personally, secretly recorded audio clips were published by the Global Shura on this contestation. And since then, we have seen, very much in line with today's practices of globalization and competing cultural and religious claims, a bursting, an outburst of social media activity from both sides. They have competing social media accounts, they have competing statements, leaked videos and audios are constantly being revealed on both sides to discredit the other. We now have the last peace initiative came from religious scholars in Pakistan in January who are trying to make some amends. Notably in the movement, the leaders, the activists, the decision makers, Faisal, are not always religious scholars. They are also often lay people. And here now, religious scholars intervened from the Deobandi group, but it's still out in the open. Let's go beyond this to the global extension of the movement. A significant ground for scene for Tablighi activity is the UK, not so surprisingly, where you have the European headquarters of the Tablighi Jamaat, which is this Dewsbury Mosque. And here in particular, they have developed in a way where many of their activities are also connected with parallel madrasas. A madrasa is a religious school, and one has to add here that, the Deobandi schools are standing out by the fact, and that's why they have achieved a certain reputation, that their religious program offers a degree, and it's a very structured program. It's an 8-year course where you, in the end, you study a lot of sources and literature, and in the end you become an alim, a religious scholar, and that is a degree. This innovation in 1856, when Deoband was founded, is kind of an copycat British college sort of innovation at that time, where the founders actually implemented whatever they had learned from the practices and structures of a British college they had attended before. And the structured system of this religious instruction is precisely what attracts people still until today, Muslims, to attend those schools, to acquire structured and certified religious knowledge. In some cases, just to add here, it is not connected with secular education, notably in South Asia, where only the primary level is compulsory to be taught in the larger madrasas. In other countries, though, and that's obviously also UK and the US and South Africa, etc., it is often also connected with secular education on the secondary level and even on the college level. So it very much depends also on the surrounding social environment and country and the demands and expectations also of the market, because this is a market situation where these schools, even if we are talking sometimes about little money or sometimes about more, are competing with each other or with other institutions offering knowledge and wisdom, secular knowledge and religious knowledge. And this is, for instance, a well-established, quite well-known Deobandi school in Britain, in Holcombe, in an old building. But it is also fairly developed, the Tablighi Jamaat, quite influential in France, which is also not much known, that after mosques supporting somehow the Muslim Brotherhood in one way or the other, the second largest, so to say, attraction and a significant number of mosques is actually affiliated with the Tablighi activities. When I was there on my research, and that's already now 10 years ago, and I was lucky that I was able to basically go to a couple of different countries where I looked at their activities, because those pictures now here, they're all taken by me. And this is, for instance, you cannot even recognize and see that this is a mosque in Paris, Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis, we know, is the problem area of Paris, where a lot of issues happen, social conflict happen, Muslims live in sometimes precarious conditions, violence sometimes happens. Well, this madrasa, which is supposed to host the national center of that movement, does not even dare to put the name and the sign of a madrasa outside. But then again, this is not the same for the whole of France, because it very much depends again on the social environment, how the movement operates. So here we have a significant number of low-income, low-educated migrant workers from the Maghreb that are coming here. But then in the south of France, in Marseille, we suddenly have a newly built mosque, which was self-consciously built by the Tablighis and their local support and their local assistance, and that also writes outside that this has been built by the Tablighi group in Marseille. My research also led me to travel to the US, where I visited a couple of Deobandi schools which are directly connected with the Tablighis. So the places I visited there were more connected with the Deoband system itself. This, for instance, is a Darul Uloom in Jamaica, in a part of New York. The reason I'm showing this to show how in different environments this culture and this, so to say, system has found its own roots and found its own survival techniques. At Darul Uloom Maryland, Baltimore. We have Houston with a huge mosque, with a huge Pakistan community, where the Tablighi Jamaat is also active, and as far as I understand is regularly convening in that particular mosque. Huge operating area, very well known in the circles of Muslim modernists, so to say, is the Institute of Islamic Education in Chicago, Elgin, which in a sense has tried to adapt again the education to a modern level. They have also slightly varied the sources they are teaching. And we have an even more modern Islamic Foundation of Toronto, which is connected with very regular institutional features of secular teaching, of secondary level, of college level, etc. So again, it very much depends on the system you are working with. Central Asia is a very interesting area. This particular person, he's also a TV moderator, and he also worked with the government in the environment of Kyrgyzstan. The Tablighi Jamaat, in a sense, was also seen by the government as a potential support for arranging peace and reconciliation between, for instance, the Kyrgyz and the Uzbek, and in the wake of the radical transformation of society with the induction of the market economy after the downfall of the Soviet Union. To the extent where they have particular orders how to dress yourself, and the extent to which the Tablighs became influential there is that the Central Asian post-Soviet republics, they have these muftiyat system. What is a muftiyat? A muftiyat is a state organization of ruling Muslim institutions from the Soviet time. And it has been to some extent extended and inherited and continued today. And the particular department, which is supposed to be in control of foreign Islamic groups to avoid them having too much influence, he actually, at that time when I was there, he himself is a Tablighi activist. And so he managed very well to, take control of that particular department. And this is, for instance, the books sold in the local bookshops, the Fazail, Amal Fazail Sadaka. This, for instance, is here. This is a mosque where they would convene normally. We have Southeast Asia, where we have older connections previously to the subcontinent, but today they are largely updated to locals. This is a former chief minister of the Malaysian state of Terengganu. He is himself a graduate of Deoband and of Al-Azhar, and in front of the Tablighi Madrasa and Markas in Kuala Lumpur, it looks like this, that these clothes are offered, and that's another interesting observation from a cultural analytical perspective. The clothes of South Asian Muslims has suddenly become a uniform, sort of a meaning, has acquired the meaning of a normative clothing of someone being observant of Quran and of the Hadith. So it's being sold, so to say, as this pious item in the small shops surrounding Tablighi centers in those areas. We have a similar situation in Indonesia. This is in Jakarta, the center of the Tablighi Jamaat, where again the same type of clothing is sold for the same reason. And in east of Java there is a small town, not so small town actually, there's a town with religious schools where the Deobandi curriculum is being taught, which has strong connection with the Tablighi Jamaat, and where you see them, this guy, for instance, he graduated from a madrasa in India, from a Deobandi madrasa, and there's a comparatively large group of people who graduated from madrasa and were teaching there. When we jump to South Africa, this is Johannesburg. In South Africa, there is a Muslim minority, which is comparatively small, that is around 3-4%, but which is extremely vibrant, extremely structured and well organized. The reason being that under apartheid, it was comparatively privileged. Why? Because it was not black, although it was not white. It was in this middle category, and thereby enjoying certain safety measures and privileges, which it used. And so they built also a couple of Deobandi schools, but in the context of the South African society and of the Muslim community there, which is comparatively well off as compared to the black population, it's a well-built private school where you have to pay a fee and where your parents drive you in the BMW. A very different situation from the madrasa situation in India and Pakistan. This is in, the other school in Azadville. A long story, to cut it short, in conclusion, we are observing a lot of new and modern formats of this movement over the last, well, almost 100 years or so that the movement exists since 1926. There's an expansion. There's, yes, to some extent, a similarity of formats in different countries. There's also a tendency to grow more ideological, but also more development-oriented in its interventions. But what we can see is it's marking and making place and space for Muslim communities in global exchange, and thereby representing a format of globalization from the South that I would argue is hitherto not yet fully studied and understood, because in times of important restructuring of the world, where we are struggling to get to a system of global governance, cultural, religious, ideological references, as we have noted in politics in Europe and elsewhere, have regained importance for people to accommodate themselves in today's world. Thank you.